Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Malebo Sepodi. I am joining you from Oldenburg, Germany, and I am the moderator for today's dialogue. For the benefit of participants who are blind or who have visual impairments, all speakers will begin with a short description. So I will start. I am a Black woman. I am wearing red framed reading glasses. I have red lipstick on, and my hair is in Bantu knots. For those who are new today, Digital Dialogues is a series of panel discussions exploring civil society perspectives on the emerging digital world. Today's discussion topic is focused on how technology can help address global food security challenges. Food security remains one of the most pressing global concerns, with vulnerabilities amplified in recent years by disruptions to supply chains, climate crises, and economic inequalities that have profoundly impacted the livelihoods of small scale farmers. These challenges continue to highlight the need for innovative solutions to ensure equitable access um, to food for all. Today, we ask how can digital technologies rather, including artificial intelligence, play a transformative role in achieving food security? Together, we will explore these questions through diverse contexts from the global south to the global north. In many African contexts, for example, different urban and rural agricultural initiatives are already supported by tech tools. Hence, there's hope that digital tools can power small scale and marginalized farmers, bridging the gap between producers and consumers while localizing food systems. Meanwhile, in the global north, food security is not always a central policy priority. Yet, digital innovations are being applied to improve agricultural sustainability, mitigate the climate crisis, and build resilient systems that align with global environmental goals. The objectives of our dialogue today are threefold, and we hope that we can get through all of them: to understand the evolving role of digital technologies and AI in addressing food security challenges, to think about technologies that are shaping agricultural practices worldwide, and to discuss how we can localize food systems, making them more sustainable and accessible. To help us navigate this conversation, we are joined by a terrific panelists who bring unique perspectives from their respective fields. We are joined by Alex Patsaitis, who is a researcher at the Ragnar Nuxa Department of Innovation and Governance, Tallinn University of Technology, and a core member of the P2P Lab. We're also joined by Linda Godfrey, who is a principal scientist at the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, otherwise known as CSIR. And Linda is an extraordinary professor at Northwest University, South Africa, and holds a PhD in engineering. Matthias Nachtmann, who is in sustainability business development at the BASF Agricultural Solutions. Full bios will be dropped in the chat when each speaker provides their opening input. So now each panelist will share a brief introduction to their work and how it relates to today's theme. We will then have some discussion and questions. At any point during the presentations, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. We will try to get through all the questions. Due to time constraints, we will do our best. Linda, would you please turn on your camera and join me? Please introduce yourself and don't forget to start with a self-description. I look forward to hearing your inputs. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you very much, Maleva. And I can just confirm you can hearing me all right?
Perfect.
Lovely. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to join you today from a very, very hot Pretoria, South Africa, where we're currently experiencing a heat wave. And hence why I have a very stripy t-shirt on. It was the coolest thing I could find in this heat. So it's an absolute pleasure to join you today. I'm a white woman wearing my glasses. Clearly, the hair is grayer than it should be with too many wrinkles, considering how much time I seem to spend behind my desk. So it's lovely to chat to you about this particular topic today. I will say that I am neither a digital technology specialist nor a food security specialist. But what I am is a circular economy specialist. And so I'm looking at this particular question of can digital technology help address global food security challenges through the lens of a circular economy? So, what is the circular economy? There is this misunderstanding that the circular economy is about waste management or it's about waste recycling. But the circular economy is really about sustainable resource management, and hence a topic that's so relevant to food security. If you look at the Circularity Gap Report of 2023, it notes that our food system is by far the largest driver of land use change globally. Our food system is a major driver of climate change and ocean acidification. It's responsible for 70% of global accessible freshwater withdrawals through irrigation, and it contributes to the vast majority of nutrient overload and is the single largest driver of biodiversity loss. It's a highly resource intensive sector. And so it raises this question: how can we address these big challenges facing our food system through a more circular economy? And what would the role of the digital economy or digital technology be in helping us achieve that and helping us achieve greater food security? So, the 3 points that I specifically want to look at, the 3 examples as to where we can see the circular economy and digital economy interfacing in this space. The first is in decoupling the production of food and feed from resource consumption. For example, the fact that we use near 70% of water for our agricultural sector. So, application of digital technologies such as precision agriculture, the use of satellite technology, drone technology, GIS, sensor technology can help us to irrigate, for example, at the right time in the right areas where we need it, depending on our crop use. The second area is in reducing food losses and waste. The fact that a third of the food that we produce is lost or wasted globally. And if you think about the amount of energy, water, materials, nutrients that went into producing that food that very often is disposed before it even reaches our plate. And in countries that are facing serious issues around poverty, hunger, malnutrition, how can we live in a world where we are wasting a third of the food that we produce? So, application of digital technologies like platforms that link farmers to market, that they can link to a market before food is spoilt, uh, better prices for the products they produce, but digital platforms that can link a farmer to a market. Again, precision agriculture, insight into future yields so that they can start to plan in advance with regards to access to market. And then the third area to highlight is improved access to equipment and technology, especially in the global south, where many farmers, especially small scale farmers, don't always have access or can't afford to access certain technology that would improve their yields. So, again, digital technologies like the sharing economy. If you think of businesses like Hello Tractor, which is almost like the Uber equivalent for tractors, where you may not necessarily be able to afford to have a tractor of your own, but maybe you only need it for 1 week in the year. And through platforms like that, you can book a tractor with a driver who can come in and help plow or harvest. So, those are just 3 examples of driving greater circularity, where there's a very important role for the digital economy to play in that space that would reduce our resource use and demand, reduce the impact of the agriculture sector, and ultimately improve food security. And there are many examples like this, whether it be in aquaponics or aquaculture, crop rotation, or composting. But these are just 3 examples that I wanted to highlight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda, and I appreciate you starting off just explaining um, what a circular economy in your type of work is. And this is exactly what this conversation is about. It's multidisciplinary, it's interdisciplinary, it's bringing all of us together to think through these topics. And I look forward to hearing you grapple more with the questions that we have and the audience has today. Thank you so much, Linda. Matthias, could you please switch on your camera and join me? Thank you so much, Matthias. I look forward to hearing your inputs. Please introduce yourself. Let us know where you are sitting, and don't forget to start with a self-description. Welcome, Matthias, to the Digital Dialogue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much having me. So I'm a middle-aged white male sitting in southwest Germany right now, about 0 degrees Celsius at the moment, and very cloudy and foggy. And I'm really very delighted to talk about things and technologies. I work with farmers since about 20 years, and especially discuss how and why this is relevant for food safety. And I would like to start with yield. I would like to start with yield because one of the tasks I teach agricultural data for data scientists and for informatics students. And more than half of the students here in the RPTU Kaiserslautern come from Asia and Africa. And when you look closer what digital farming can do for food security, we first start in the lecture understanding what are the yield limiting factors. So if you grow a crop, for example, if you grow corn, the absolute yield depends on two factors. It depends on soil and location specific factors, and it depends on seasonal specific factors. And if you look to the local factors like the soil type, the radiation, or even the day length, this is key to be able to know what crop to grow. And if you look to the seasonal factors like temperature, precipitation, pests, weeds, or diseases, that are really very crucial for the tasks and the decisions a farmer needs to make and an action they need to make. Now you might ask, okay, Matthias, but how and why digital technologies come into play? So usually when you look to basic information, basic tools like sensors, like a weather station or a camera or a satellite, either camera mounted on the satellite or camera mounted on the smartphone, they can help you either to analyze and identify something, for example, a rootworm, an insect, and also guide you to sources how and what to do with that situation. Is it crucial for your yield or is it not crucial for your yield? And you also on top and based on that you can also plan your activities better. For example, it's very important to know the precipitation patterns of the next 2 to 3 weeks when you plan a seeding task or fertilization task or even a harvesting task. When you look at these technologies, and also when I started about end of the last millennium engaging in digital, there was an impression that all these technologies are big technologies which needs to be mounted to a combine. You heard me saying and talking about satellites or about a tractor. But there's one key topic which I also teach my students, and I do always this. This is the temporal and the spatial resolution of data and temporal and spatial resolution of your operation. So for example, if you rather experience and you have big machinery which can drive steered by a satellite, then you also need very detailed and very high resoluted data to manage it. For example, also a robot. But if you are, let's say, taking over the land from your father just newly, if you're not that much experienced, and if it's already enough to understand what are the key tasks for the next 2 weeks, even a smartphone can make already a difference. And in a smartphone, you usually have data accessibility with a lower resolution in terms of spatial and temporal resolution. So, for example, a classical weather pattern I know in Central Europe is a resolution of 1 square kilometer. If you have a weather station, you can have it much more specific. Now, just to give you one example why I'm so super excited that you invite me for this discussion. You might have read that I'm also heading the Friends of Digital Farming, which is a nonprofit organization which is engaging in funding research, development, and talents in digital farming. And we fund a professor, but also projects. And one of the members of our association, the weather station company PESL, they currently try to build 100,000 weather stations in Africa. So if there's someone interested to discuss in more detail, I'm happy to connect. And why I'm so delighted about that weather stations going to Africa. When we launched, and now I jump to the BASF role I have, in 2013, our digital farming program, we got an email by a farmer from Brazil who said, "Thank you for democratizing agricultural know-how, how to grow crops." And that's my last statement. If you look closer, how you can use crop models, pest models, disease models to forecast agricultural measures. A lot of such models are available at universities and can also be used and accessed by NGOs and made this agricultural know-how available to also smallholders or not tractor driving farmers. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for your contribution. I now invite Alex to switch on the um, video. Thank you so much, Alex. Please briefly tell us where you are sitting and introduction, and don't forget self-description. We look forward to hearing your input. Thank you, Alex.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I apologize from some violent coughing interruption that I might be having. I am Alex. I'm currently in Greece, sitting in my little home office. I am a fairly pale white guy, blonde for Greece, maybe not for Denmark, and doing my best to have a beard and also wearing glasses. Um, I'm a member, so I work, I'm a researcher. I work with universities primarily in Estonia and Spain in Europe, but I'm also a member of a research collective, which we call the P2P Lab. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Well, we try to stand in between academia and activism, trying to work with communities that try to develop technology in a different way. So we're very much technology focusing, but looking at open technologies and the digital commons. So the the practices that emerged into the with the diffusion of the internet and information and communication technologies, where communities all over the world started sharing software code, information in projects like Wikipedia and free and open source software, or technological design, open design communities, in ways that they were self-managed and taking care of the shared resources together based on commonly agreed rules. And since then, the internet and digital technology has been very much dominated by big tech and kind of a certain stream of extractive practices that have taken over what technological advanced means. But being situated in this digital commons universe, we observed a potential convergence of how these practices that first appear in the digital realm started to travel into the physical realm as well. So the globally available digital commons of knowledge, of software and design were able to be transferred through shared spaces like maker spaces or community gardens, communities mobilizing local resources using those global digital commons. And inspired by that, we went back from the global digital realm back to our hometowns in the Greek mountains and started to come together with community of local small scale farmers, engineers, makers, and trying to see how we can um, facilitate the development of a different sort of technology and organizational practices around them. And so for the past 10 years, we have been working with this community of small scale farmers and um, communities of professionals and activists around food and localized production. Uh, and experimenting with, for instance, farming tools that these farmers cannot find into the markets because typically farming technologies are built for large scale industrial agriculture, whereas in the mountains you have small scale, low intensity, maybe agroecological practices, and this requires a different technological approach. So we began looking at shared knowledge and technological design and how to mobilize local resources in co-designing and manufacturing open source and open design farming tools, and looking for appropriate collective practices that are appropriate for mountainous production and the revitalization of these areas that have long been in the process of abandonment and desolation. And most importantly, this experimentation has led to a revitalization of our imagination on what it means to have advanced technologies and how visions of progress become appropriated by local communities. So, trying to move away from the typical extractive practices that are evinced by big tech that just appropriate the relational dynamic that people bring into the digital realm, and in the way they deplete the social fabric upon which their activity is based, and try to explore more convivial forms of co-producing and living through the commons that point out to alternative trajectories of technological advance and societal progress as a whole. And I'll leave it to that quite inspiring level, and I would be happy to share more details over the questions.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing some of your work. We look forward to hearing more and seeing what our distinguished guests today, our audience, if they have any questions, please do put in your questions in the chat box and I will post them to the panelists. Linda, Matthias, and Alex, can you please join me um, on my screen? Thank you so much. So at this time, I think it's for me, I speak for me, and I know a lot of our past audience have always appreciated where the panelists can come together and discuss their points and ask each other questions based on if there are any threads or any critical issues that you would like to kind of like seep out in each other's insights today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening. So I'm going to open up to the panelists, Linda, Matthias, Alex. Please feel free to ask each other questions or to just comment on each other's insight. I don't know who's willing to go first. Linda, I see your hand.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd love to hear more from Matthias about the weather stations across Africa, because there's definitely an opportunity for further discussion there.
Yeah, one of the friends of digital farming, and just one sentence for the friends. So we are 14 members from a dairy company and a mill recently, 5 farmers, and also companies who supply farmers, like a distributor, but also BASF, John Deere, and other machinery companies. And Gottfried Pessel with Metos Weather Stations is one of those. And he just the company just turned 40, and he said he has sold now 100,000 weather stations to the rest of the world, and now he wants to focus in the second part of his career only on Africa, because right now there are only 2,000 weather stations in Africa, and he wants to bring it to 100,000. And why this is relevant? I was talking about the yield limiting factors, and basically the key information is always related to weather, which is not a surprise. But and so he is doing that. I'm happy to connect you afterwards, Linda. His mindset is very business driven, so that's why he's very powerful, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. But maybe that brings me, if this is fair, to one key requirement often is forgotten. To operate a million weather station, or 100,000 even, or to operate a good agricultural app, for example, in 10 different African and 20 different European countries, for example, requires one key thing to assure you can operate that seamlessly, secure, and reliable. And this is standardization of data. And I think this is where the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere can join forces, because everyone could save money in providing digital tools if we agree on what are the terminologies we name crops with. For example, the FAO published AgroVoc, which is a huge area of vocabularies, and there is defined, for example, the name of wheat, which has the advantage, if you program an app for, I don't, also in India, you would say, for example, for Hindi, then you find how to write wheat in Hindi. And then you can also look how you write wheat in German. So this will be Weizen. And there's all other languages available, which helps really to save cost if you internationalize, if you go broader with the digital tools. So I would like to name here the watch out: standardization of backend data for digital tools, with the advantage that tools can be used across borders and across territories more seamlessly and cheaper.
Thank you so much. Linda, are you fine with, do you have a comment?
Oh, no, definitely. I will pick up the conversation separately with Matthias. And I think his point around the standardization of data is such an important one, but it also brings us into the discussion in terms of access to data.
Yeah.
Who has access to data, and how is that data used, and is it used for the right purposes? And that takes us down a whole other avenue in terms of risk and data security. And while it sounds wonderful in theory, sometimes the misuse of that same data can be quite harmful. So separate discussion around that one.
And maybe we can come back to that discussion, because it is quite an important discussion around particularly vulnerable communities and the way that data is used. Matthias, Alex, do you have a question or comment to your fellow panelists?
If I may follow up on the discussion and taking the thread from the data as well. In our I'm a researcher on technology, and from where we come from, the technology is not just about the artifact; it's most importantly about the processes and activities around the artifact and the knowledge associated with that. So technology is this creative force of bringing something new into the world. And in this, I would like to ask both my panelists. So taking the example of a weather station, this is a technological artifact. How are you engaging with critical questions about not only of where this technology is being installed and used, but to all of the different stages before that, from the technological design, the data assemblages and the knowledge associated around that, the manufacturing of the process, the waste of the materials, and how can this be addressed when, especially when it comes to serving vulnerable communities and the global south?
Linda?
Yeah, a really, really important question, Alex. And I think I'd probably like to focus on the post side. So once you have the weather station, for example, in place, how do you maintain it and how do you sustain it beyond that? Because we do know that in developing countries, we really struggle with that. You know, very often we'll get donor funding or aid to put specific technology in place, and you go back a year later or 2 years later and it hasn't been maintained. And if we are going to put infrastructure like this in place, where does the ownership lie? Where does the responsibility for maintenance lie? And I think that for me is probably the most important question. Then, you know, you can, what technology, the design, all of those kinds of things, I think those are the easier problems to solve, as opposed to making sure that there's a long life to the infrastructure and the technology that we do put in place. And I don't know if I have the answer for that.
Matthias?
I think this is a joint problem, independent of north or
Mm,
south. Um, and in the time I do business development, I had my phase where I really was excited about technology, and what you bring then to farmer is technology. And then if he does not feel and see the benefit immediately, then the weather station will rotten. Yeah, and I have an example. By the way, I have one here with Northern Farmer. He didn't use it. But when you come with, and we started our approach some years ago, saying what we actually want to do is produce yield. And if you want to produce yield, and if you look even on a weekly basis on the result of the weather station, then you can improve your yield. That is then the trigger to start to engage. It's a little bit simplified, maybe, yeah. But I think starting from the end of the process, which is the motivating piece, which is usually not technology, and how to use the technology would be one aspect. There's another aspect to it, um, due to open source data from satellites, you name it, you find almost everything in the internet, plus AI. You can actually produce synthetic data now. You do not need agronomy data from local communities as it has been 10 or 20 years ago. And now this is a threat as well as an opportunity, because um, financial institutions or even industry could know theoretically what is the yield in this area, and can make different pricing, or let's say positive, um, can advise even better. So we see a future where data is not only depending on the local communities building weather stations or having cameras, but there are much more additional sources for this data right now.
mm. Alex, do you have any comment?
No, basically, I was thinking, juxtaposing the different paradigms with the types of practices that we have been trying to experiment with, where communities of farmers um, engage in the production and manufacturing of technologies themselves, and hence enhance their position in maintaining and uh, reducing waste on demand with through on demand production. A lot of circular practices are obviously into place here, and then um, maybe the concept of data sovereignty is relevant here, that it but in which communities have control over the data they want to produce, and which uses they may be qualified over others. But here I think a crucial element, I will just a comment from my side to put on the table, is that in order for these functions to be able to take over, we need to consider the limitations to the market, and what other distribution and circulation mechanisms are available in technology that do not reproduce the structural inequalities of, for instance, global trade, or the power dynamics between global financial institutions and local stakeholders.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think at this point, I will go to the questions that the audience members had an opportunity to send us questions just before. But before I read a question, I have a question for Linda. And I mean, you mentioned that the sharing economy is a, a, it's you mentioned that the sharing economy is a great mechanism for improving access to agricultural equipment. So, how can digital platforms facilitate this, particularly with small scale farmers? How have you found that work? Um, how have you found in your work or any case, particularly in South Africa or Africa or in the global South, in terms of, access to this agricultural equipment, but particularly dealing with the issue of who has access and who doesn't have access in the global South?
Thank you, Maleba. Yes, so
Mm,
I think probably one of the biggest challenges facing small scale farmers in the global south is having the funding to be able to purchase large equipment and infrastructure. And I think also in the context of a circular economy, the fact that so much agricultural equipment sits idle for a large part of the year. So it's not necessarily the best use of resources. You harvest for a certain period in the year, you plow for a certain period in the year, and is that's kind of maximum utility out of those resources? And what the sharing economy says is, I don't need a tractor, I need access to a tractor. And that's where the opportunity for the digital economy comes in. Things like cell phone apps, where like Uber, I can say it's now time for me to harvest. I need access to a harvester or a tractor, or whatever it is. I can use the app similar to what I would book a ride on Uber, and I can book my tractor for the next week, and the tractor will arrive with a driver, and it costs me just for the use of that tractor in that week. And once I've harvested, that tractor will move on to another farm and go and help that farmer to harvest. And so it's a business opportunity for someone who can afford to buy the tractor, who will literally go from farm to farm to farm, servicing small scale farmers, for example. And that's just simply through kind of a mobile platform app. And there are many examples like this that are already in use. The big challenge, I suppose, comes to, in many areas, do farmers have access to mobile technology, to
Mm-hmm.
connectivity that would allow them to access that kind of service? Um, and I see Matthias's hand is up. So let
Okay.
Matthias build on what I've just said.
Yeah, I'm glad Matthias' hand is up because I was going to ask Matthias a follow-up question based on what you said. But Matthias, go ahead.
I worked several time in India, and I hope this is also fair as a southern world example. And I must admit the way, and this is the first time I was there about 5 to 10 years ago. And number one, the network availability in terms of is available and bandwidth, so how much data can go through it, was partly way better than, for example, here in Germany in remote areas. So number one. Number two, also the use of smartphones in the farming communities, which was much wider accepted than here. Yeah, so in my part. So, and what I just want to say, Linda, from that perspective, I think there are all kind of scenarios. The world is not black and white anymore. That's what I learned with digital. So the best digital farmer I met was a almost 70-year-old white old man who did his own weather forecast, yield forecast based on an intelligent way documenting precipitation data. So I think there are very good examples in also in the southern hemisphere, also from Africa. I know examples where you use intelligent steering of irrigation and reach way higher tonnage of yield of wheat, for example, than in my area here. So in principle, you are right. So the limitations of access to technologies, especially the bigger and the, let's say, the more productive the technologies are, that's correct. And at the same time, when it comes to digital technologies, the entry level is much lower than I thought, at least when I visited India the first time.
Hmm. And maybe to bring you in, Matthias here, I mean, you've been working with a diverse community of farmers and in the Greek mountains. Maybe you can share some insights from these collaboration and in terms of how they've contributed to developing open source farming tools based on what your colleagues have just said.
Sorry, that's for me, right?
Yeah, Alex. Oh, did I say
Okay.
Matthias?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Alex, I'm sorry about that. That's for you,
No,
Alex.
no worries. Yeah, so if I get the question correctly, is how does uh just to make a sort of comparison or complementary approach to how what are the different challenges and opportunities opened up by working with open source technology in this different paradigm of technological development. Um, for instance, these one of the key elements is that us having completed PhDs and the whatnots around
Mm.
technology and stuff like that. Just getting into the mountains and first observing the local practices and what it happens and what are the real challenges and the local conditions was already a very first step to improve our learning and enhance our understanding of the situation. So digital or non-digital, when working with technologies, it is very much I couldn't highlight enough how important it is to try and embed any new knowledge or integration into the socio-ecological context in which you're trying to intervene. And for instance, one of the one of the things I notice is just discussing sharing economy practices like for instance, having a ride share equivalent for tractors, is that in most locations, especially in places where they face chronic issues with connectivity infrastructure and so on, they already have such practices in place. There might be that guy from the village which you find in the local coffee shop every Thursday and Tuesday that happens to have this machine and kind of circulates around the different farms. So for me, one of the alternative ways to make sense of that would be what would be the benefits of enhancing these local practices with a digital layer that improves the effectiveness and the resource allocation, instead of, say, having a multinational corporation like Uber or Lyft getting into the business of allocating local resources with not questionable regard about the local biophysical conditions and the local um, the real needs of the location. So these are the kinds of extractive practices I mentioned about in how big tech often gets involved in social relationships. And yeah, I would just leave it here.
Okay, Matthias, I see you.
So what we learned over the last years and we launched the first digital tools to Northern Hemisphere farmers about 7, 8 years ago, that you need to always think from the farming practice as it is right now. Because if you do two things, and from that perspective, I would fully underline what Alex said. Um, if you need to convince him about two things, doing different practice and using an additional tool, it's just too big of an effort. And that was also a challenge for me personally to recognize that, because if you produce a product, then you're convinced about the product, and you're not having, and now talking about the northern hemisphere example, in the morning at 6 o'clock when the farmer starts working, hopping onto the tractor, and the implement and the software and the seed, everything needs to work seamlessly together, and that perspective just grew over time. So the agricultural practice of the farm as it is right now needs to be supported by a digital tool and not transformed in two big steps. So fully support about what Alex said.
Thank you. Um, Linda, we have a question here that says, and this question comes up whenever we discuss digital technologies, AI, particularly for the global south. The question reads, and this is a pre-submitted question: how can we guard against unfair use of technologies by big tech and agrochemicals manufacturers to kill and destroy Africa's food systems?
Such an important question, Maleba, and I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that. Having, other than saying, it's something that we absolutely need to be aware of. It is encouraging to see, and this is not only just about digital technology, but also with regards to the variety of crops that, for example, are available on the African continent, and how slowly over time, so many of those indigenous crops have kind of disappeared in the system.
Mm,
And around ensuring that we sustain that diversity in the crops that we do have. And I think, for me at least, the starting point is the awareness around this, um, and making sure that through, I'm not a big fan of over regulating, but making sure that we do have appropriate policy in place to protect where it is needed to protect. So and especially given the number of small scale farmers across the continent, is making sure that their livelihoods are protected. because certainly when it comes to the circular economy, this vision of hectares and hectares of crop under monocrop with high chemical fertilizer use, high pesticide use, that's the furthest thing from what we want. And so we're wanting to drive a future agriculture sector on the continent that is regenerative by nature, that is harnessing these opportunities of indigenous crops.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure, I don't think I've actually answered your question other than to say a good starting point is simply to be aware of this and making sure that these rights are protected.
I mean, we also think about how indigenous knowledges also kind of seem to get lost in between, and how does that get protected? I see your hand,
Absolutely.
Alex, and with that, Alex, I also want you to attempt Barris's question. I think it fits in right well where it says from the question that was asked to Linda, and then you just make the comment and then answer this question. It says major NGOs have been slow to act on the potential of collaboration for impact investing at scale. Is there a chance that business and other parties committed to digital dividends for the most of the world could finance a special purpose vehicle to finance locally managed solutions? If you need to reread it, it's in the chat box, but continue, Alex.
Yeah, I think I miss a lot of the context around this question, so I'll try my best to
Yeah.
not be completely relevant. Just my comment in the previous discussion was that I think this is what is best is signified with the language around globally now being shifting from agriculture to food security or food sovereignty, because it's not although it was mentioned a couple of times, and no, undoubtedly yield is important to cover food security needs. It is not need not become the single most important measure, especially when it comes to, again, bringing in the socio-ecological and cultural context of how communities used to provide for themselves. So for me, and to maybe connect to the next question with that, I mean, for me, the
Mm,
most important question in planning food sovereignty and food security policies is not so much how hovering around the maximization of efficient use of resources in a using a predetermined idea of how much production is enough, or how we can make the best out of the minimum resources. Is more of focusing on how we can provide the best means for local communities to be able to provide for themselves, to mobilize the resources they already have, the knowledge and the practices that have been providing for these communities for millennials. Um, and then what is the most appropriate synthesis of the advanced technologies that we can bring in hand to enhance those capabilities? And in this perspective, I'm fairly skeptical of any global financial initiatives trying to transfer resources towards the most vulnerable communities, rather than uh, whereas I think it's more efficient to think, it's more useful to think in terms of how we can um, emancipate resources that have been held idle due to different global regulatory measures, in order to be able to be mobilized for local provisioning.
Yeah, before we get to our closing remarks, because we have 5 minutes till the top of the hour left, Matthias, maybe you could deal with this question. I hope you can deal with this question. It says, how do we deal with the radiation effects of the electromagnetic waves on plants that might be harmful? And I think to generalize it, basically, how do you deal with the harmful effects of technology? And how do then maybe small scale farmers maintain agency throughout the process? I don't know if process is the word, but I'm sure you understand.
It's a it's a big question. I think, working for a company like BASF, who's used to produce chemicals and register and test the chemicals, and investing more than half of all the product investing costs in evaluate the security, also knowing that not everyone would share this perspective. So coming from such a background, exposing something to the market that is secure and regulated. So that's a little bit my background of understanding testing technology and risk, but also knowing at the same time that we want to have an active ingredient or an active or a tool that does something. So I must admit, from a digital perspective, when I did my PhD, we looked at the which is more than 25 years ago. We looked at also the negative effects of the knowledge society. Yeah, because you can do good with a smartphone app like Plantix that can identify a weed in a second. At the same time, the models are operated in clouds which consume a lot of energy. So I think um, it's fair to ask what are the side effects of digitalization. At the same time, I must admit I'm more on the application side. I think what I see there is, and that's also related to a question that came earlier. What we see, if you use technology, then the use of inputs goes down. And I think that's something. So, for example, there are models out there in the market by BASF, but also others that tell when it would make sense to spray and when not to spray. So I think that prevents at least putting products out there when there is no need. That's number one. Number two is if you have a recommendation of a dose rate, or in the developed world, we call it a smart sprayer. So it takes every meter a photograph of the crops, and if there is a weed, it's sprayed. But if it's just the target crop, then it's not sprayed, which is also reducing the amount of chemicals put on the soil and on the crop, even up to 70%. So I think what it takes is a very open discussion. What are the costs and the benefits of new technologies? And I'm happy. And I heard the word sovereignty. We also need to talk about data sovereignty. So let's have an open discussion. How? And that's not only applied to smallholders, that applies also to food producers, also to bigger farmers. If you want to be active in the digitalized world, how you can put your data on the market for your benefit, without having this not good feeling sharing data, because that's very clear. We either have the chance to digitalize not only the individual processes but also the markets. So right now in the northern hemisphere, we talk a lot about data spaces, so sharing data based on public data, proving compliance with production methodologies and so on. But if you want to do that, then we need to ensure that all players have also data sovereignty. I hope that answers the question: how to deal with technologies, the good and the bad, and also the sovereignty of each player.
Thank you so much. It does give us a lot of, I nearly said food for thought, but it does give us a lot of thought around it. Um, just thank you so Hayla Hayek for your contribution and your comments around the work that your organization does. And maybe as a closing, for the panelists, just 1 minute each. Um, what, if there were any takeaways or action points for our audience to implement or advocate for in relation to, global food security, and the use of digital technology to mitigate the challenges, what would they be? Just 1 minute each, and then we close. I'll start with you, Linda.
Yeah, for me, my takeaway from this is that digital technology has a role to play in addressing food security, but ultimately it has to come with a benefit to the farmer, because otherwise it's going to be a burden and it's not going to be a sustainable practice.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Linda. Matthias?
Yeah, for me, it became very much evident and important that data sovereignty is the basis that everyone, not only in the southern or northern hemisphere, we need to have a joint set of rules how we deal with the data, and not divide us between different parts of the world and different interpretations of data sovereignty. And the other thing is, start with weather data, because with that you already can have an initial very big yield effect. which is improving food security.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Alex?
My my summary would be that when we think about digital technologies, we tend to think in terms of very large scale seamlessness, and to a large extent, it all boils down to productivity enhancements. However, looking at the history of digital technology and also the diverse practices emerging through and within that, this is just one of the paradigms of how digital technology can be deployed. And so I would invite the public discourse to engage in more imaginative ways on how different digital narratives can integrate, especially when it comes to farming and food production. So we can have things that are more digital and things that are less digital, and find a synthesis that would be like digital enough on how much of it is to the benefit of the farmers, as it was mentioned, and the society and its reproduction thereof.
Thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of our discussion. And thank you to the audience for being patient and for sitting through. And thank you so much for the questions that you have posed to the panelists. Thank you, Linda, Matthias, and Alex, for sharing your insights with us today. It has given us something to go back and critically engage with.